Welcome to the Jedburgh podcast. I'm the creator and host, Fran Racioppi. Each episode, I speak with transformative leaders, visionaries, drivers of change, and those dedicated to winning no matter the challenge. The Jedburgh podcast is founded in the lineage of the Special Operations Jedburgh teams of the past and is produced in partnership with Talent War Group, a management consulting and executive search firm focused on helping you optimize the people side of your business. We're sponsored by Jersey Mike Subs. Together, we share the mission of giving, making a difference in someone's life. Visit the Jedburgh Podcast, Talent War Group, and Jersey Mike Subs on the web and on all social media. A percentage of all proceeds is dedicated to the Green Beret Foundation, supporting America's Special Forces and their families.
Green Beret Special Forces are not a break glass in time of war force, sitting at home station, training, waiting for the call. They're employed day in, day out for pretty much all their 70 years. They're doing what we talked about before, this quiet work of preparing and investing so that the nation has different options in case of crisis.
Deo Preso Liber, the motto of the Green Berets and the U.S. Army Special Forces. In my opinion, the greatest warriors, soldiers, and people the world has ever seen. People committed to the mission, to each other, and to winning at a level most others can never understand. Being selected for and serving as a Green Beret will always be one of the greatest achievements of my life. Leaders are built in the Special Forces and they're sent all over the world, in the good times and the bad, to protect the American way of life, even if it means giving up their own. The Jedburghs of World War II were the precursor to the U.S. Army Special Forces. Many of the Jedburghs who parachuted into occupied France the night before D-Day went on to don the first Green Berets alongside President John F. Kennedy. Today, the Green Berets are part of U.S. Army Special Operations Command and include not only Green Berets, but Army Rangers, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Civil Affairs, and Psychological Operations. Even the best leaders need to be led. So for this episode, I traveled back to the home of U.S. Army Special Operations, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to meet with retired Lieutenant General Ken Tovo. General Tovo commanded U.S. Army Special Operations Command. He's led at every level of command, including serving as the commander of 10th Special Forces Group, my alma mater. He was the commanding general of Special Operations Command Central and the deputy commanding general of U.S. Southern Command. As the epicenter of U.S. Army Special Operations, Fort Bragg is home to the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School and the Special Forces Museum. Generals get stuff done. So I called in a few favors and I sat down with General Tovo in the museum under the regimental flag of the 1st Special Service Force. General Tovo and I discussed how Special Operations has changed over the 80 years since its inception, the strategic importance of the Special Forces Regiment in our national security, and what it means to be a Green Beret. We also talk about selecting top talent and what the Army and America need from the next generation of special operators as we fully embrace the peer-to-peer competition we haven't seen since the Cold War. Today, General Tovo serves as the chairman of the Green Beret Foundation, where he continues his service to our special operators and their families. Green Beret Foundation is one of the only veteran service organizations to receive accreditation by the Department of Veterans Affairs to aid in the streamlined processing of medical claims for former operators. As a Green Beret and in the lineage of the Jedburgh teams of the past, starting from this episode, the Jedburgh podcast will donate a percentage of all proceeds to the Green Beret Foundation. General Tovo is the definition of a Green Beret and a special operator. Between this recording and its release, he received a Lifetime Achievement Award for his service. Take a listen to my conversation with retired Lieutenant General Ken Tovo from the Special Forces Museum at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School on your favorite podcast platforms. Watch the full video version of our discussion on YouTube. Subscribe to us and follow at Jedburgh Podcast on all social media. Check out our website, jedburghpodcast.com. Learn more about Lieutenant General Tovo and get involved with the Green Beret Foundation at greenberetfoundation.org and on social media at Green Beret Foundation. See what it takes to join our nation's most elite group of warriors at soc.mil. General Tovo, sir, welcome to the Jedburgh Podcast.
Ken will be fine.
And thanks for okay. Guys always do that to me.
About that
you always do that to me. Everyone I've had on has done that to me, and it's so hard for me to break that habit.
You should have learned by now, right? I mean,
I should have learned by now. Ken, thanks for coming.
Yeah, muscle memory is hard to overcome, and that one's fairly ingrained.
I was a lowly captain, so I still remember that. You know, it's like everything stops when you get out. You know, and it's like it's frozen in time, so you kind of remember that.
Get past. I mean, I've been out for 4 years now. I sit on at least one board with a guy I used to work for. He was a 4-star general. I don't call him by his first name. I call him Sir
Yeah.
or General in his name. It's ingrained.
It is ingrained. Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you coming down. You have spent a tremendous amount of time at Fort Bragg, and I asked you to come down here on a Saturday to sit here with me, and so I very much appreciate that. But I mean, we're here. We're at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School. We're in the museum, and Roxanne, give a huge shout out right off the bat to Roxanne for coming in and setting this up for us. But absolutely phenomenal place, and we're going to take a ton of video and do a walkthrough after this. But wow,
yeah, it's the heart of the Army Special Operations community in many ways, but certainly the heart of the Special Forces.
And I also have to thank General Linder. Everybody always asks me who do I look up to and who's my mentor in life, and it's General Jim Linder all the time. And I have to applaud him and thank him for reaching out to General Beaupere, the SWIC commander, and making all this happen. So huge shout out, everybody. I don't care what people say about the general officers. They make things happen. And when it has to get done, they make the phone calls and it gets done.
Good.
And we have the 10th Group Mafia, in action too with General Beaupere and you and me. And so it all ties in, and we're going to talk about so many different things, but let's start for a second with you as we sit here in the home of Army Special Forces, being a Green Beret, but it goes so much further beyond that. You served as the commanding general of USASOC, U.S. Army Special Operations Command. This is an organization that was started post-World War II by many of the Jedburghs. And before we started, you talked about Colonel Aaron Bank being at your graduation ceremony from the Q course. I mean, these are the guys who started the lineage back in World War II and parachuting behind enemy lines and really setting the stage for what has become one of, and I would say, the most elite organization that sits on the planet. And you led them, and you led Green Berets, Rangers, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Psyops, Civil Affairs, started at West Point, commanded at every level in 10th Group, Commanding General of SOC CENT, the Deputy Commanding General at SOC. You're instrumental in Afghanistan and Iraq through many deployments. Also served as the Deputy Commander of U.S. Southern Command. And I know I missed many, but there's so many things that you have seen as a leader, the evolution of the Army, what you have done for special operations, and today continue to do as the chairman of the Green Beret Foundation. We're going to get into it all.
Yeah, good. Look forward to it.
It's got to start somewhere. For you, it started at West Point. Why?
Well, I was one of those kids who was always destined for the military. I mean, from the earliest memory I have, I originally was going to be a fighter pilot.
Oh, everybody wants to be a fighter pilot.
I mean, I was into model airplanes. I had
Navy SEALs and fighter pilots. That's what everybody wants to be.
Models all over my room. I flew, balsa wood models, and then I was going to go to the Air Force Academy and be a jet jockey. And then about 7th grade, when they did the eye test, and I realized that I didn't see as well as everybody else. My fighter pilot dream kind of faded, but I read almost exclusively military history growing up, all through, I think I read every book in our library on the Civil War, World War II, et cetera. Anyway, so I was sort of destined for the military. The only question was going to be branch of service. And, one thing led to another, and it was off to West Point.
And West Point wasn't even far from your house because you grew up in New York.
100 miles from my front door to the flagpole of West Point, which, of course, in the New York metropolitan area means anywhere from 4 to 6 hours.
Oh, absolutely. Because you have to go basically through New York.
You got to go through New York City. You got to go over the bridges. It's a nightmare.
So after West Point, you started in the 82nd. So you were right down the street here on our dens. We took a drive through there this morning. Talk about the 82nd and talk about Fort Bragg, because we're here. I mean, this is the home of everything. And it's not only the home of Special Forces, but this is the home of the 82nd Airborne Division, instrumental organization throughout history of service to our U.S. military and the U.S. Army. But talk about the 82nd Airborne at that time.
Yeah, so I reported in, I think, late 83, early 84. The division was really just getting back from the invasion of Grenada.
Mm-hmm.
The battalion I joined had done a Sinai rotation for 6 months, had gone to Grenada, and so I actually did a quick 1 month tour in Grenada, when I reported in. I was destined, coming out of infantry basic course, I was destined for my battalion. And in reporting in at Fort Bragg, I reported on the day they had gotten a call from the remainder, the support element that was still left in Grenada for months afterwards. And, they needed an officer to fill a job. And literally myself and one other lieutenant were called into the Corps G1's office, and he said, asked the first guy, "Hey, are you married? Is your family settled?" And he said, "Yes, sir, I'm married. We're still looking for a place. I got 2 kids." And he looked at me, he said, "Married or single?" "Single." "Okay, you'll be deploying tomorrow." And so literally, I get my CIF issue. I deploy to Grenada, and then I start getting, I made the phone call before I left to my sponsor saying, "Hey, I'm not going to be there in the unit. I just got sent down to Grenada.
Right.
I leave tomorrow for Grenada." And so it took my future battalion commander about 3 or 4 weeks to fight through the system to get his lieutenant back. So anyway, but the 82nd was a dynamic place. It had just come off of this contingency operation in Grenada. Being a paratrooper is an ethos all its own. There's this sense of living part of history that stretches back to the jump into Normandy in World War II, and I mean it's just you can't move around Fort Bragg without the street names and the statues and everything else, just kind of building that core ethos that we're going to do hard things for the nation. And it was a great place to start out as a young infantry officer.
Yeah, there's so much camaraderie that goes in that organization. And I think even if you look at organizational design of companies, I've often have found myself referencing organizations like the 82nd, the 101st, where you talk about the mission and the history that those organizations have had in defining America and who we are and changing the world. And it's like, if you can get organizations to think about where they've come from, what they've built, and the impact that they've made, and get everybody from the most junior person to the most senior aligned to that, it creates a powerful organization.
Yeah, and you also get inculcated in this feeling that you are carrying a burden of living up to the standard that came before you, right?
Yeah.
You're inheriting the legend and the organization that was created by, in our minds, giants, right? The guy Gavin, the guys who jumped in, and and every unit, every battalion has got their pantheon of heroes from World War II and subsequent actions, and you've grown up in this. Hey, I got to live up to that standard, and it drives you.
Yeah, you don't want to let it down. You don't want to. It's like, it's not going to happen on my watch. I'm not going to be the one.
It won't be me.
Yeah. So you took the run down from Ardennes over to Special Forces one day, and you walked into the recruiter's office. How come?
Well, actually, I didn't make the final decision to come SF until I was at the infantry advanced course. I had been here in the 82nd.
Did you go to Benning?
I went to Benning, Fort Benning for the.
It's like the best 6 months.
What is now called the Captain's Career Course, and I had thought about SF for a long time. I mean, literally, back to my growing up days, on my bookshelf was Robin Moore's The Green Berets. Probably read it 6 or 7 times. I knew the stories, watched the movie, etc., and it was always in my mind. I will say that when I was here, there's a little bit of rivalry between the 82nd and the Green Berets, the Special Forces.
I think that still exists.
It still exists. It was probably even more significant back then. And in some ways, from the 82nd perspective, at least, guys that went down the street were fleeing something in the 82nd, right?
Yeah.
They had gotten into trouble, et cetera, and they were going to go find themselves a job in SF. That was probably, an overcharacterization, but it was also in the days before we had a branch.
Right.
And, SF was somewhat a secondary specialty. You could be, as an officer particularly, but NCOs as well, you could be an infantryman in a conventional unit, go do an SF tour, come back out. And so it didn't have the same level of professionalism as we developed over the years of the branch.
Right.
But anyway, I was at the Captain's Career Course, still toying with what my future would bring. I wanted, I was open to going back to the 82nd. Certainly, I loved my time here, or one of the other light divisions. Didn't really want to go to the mechanized community. Didn't want to spend time in a motor pool.
That's where I started.
And so as I started having a conversation with infantry branch of where they were going, they wanted to send me to a mech unit. And then I talked to a couple of the captains, my classmates, were late to the course. We were, most of us, fresh captains. They had been a captain for a couple of years. They were coming out of the SF community.
Right.
They'd been infantry, served in SF as well. And so hearing their stories as well. So a combination of things, branch telling me you're going to go to the mech community.
Guys telling great stories.
Telling great stories.
Yeah.
The things I kind of read about as a young kid, and all of a sudden, I talked to my wife. I said, "Hey, what do you think about this SF thing? I'm really considering it." And in the end, we made the decision. Let's give it a try. Because I said, "Hey, we can go to Panama. We can go to Okinawa, maybe Germany. There's a lot of exciting opportunities." And she said, "Yeah, whatever you want to do."
Yeah, and that was so for the next 30. That was like the last time you saw her for 30 years after you went to SF.
And that was some of the mythology about SF. God, everybody who goes is going to be deployed forever. Yeah. The divorce rate's outrageous. Oh, by the way, the divorce rate even today in SF is less than the regular Army and less than society. But the mythology is still out there. But it is a lifestyle. There's no doubt. Yeah. I mean, you're making a commitment not only for yourself but your family, and it's a demanding lifestyle for sure.
No, absolutely. And you look back on it, and I would never change my decision to have gone into number one into the Army and number two into Special Forces. Yeah, I mean, it was the greatest thing I've ever done.
No doubt, never look back.
I mean, you talk about some of the history here. I mean, it's been 80 years since the concept of the first Special Service Force was presented. We're sitting here with a flag over our head right now. I mean, and
this is the 70th year of Special Forces itself. 1952, Aaron Bank stands up the 10th Group.
Yeah, and it's been active, SOF in every conflict by the book since World War II. People will argue that there were elements in World War I that could classify as special operations or kind of special forces, but there's so much that special operations have been involved in that we've seen, we haven't seen, we'll never know about, that have shaped so much of the world. I want to ask you, because as I mentioned, you commanded all Army SOF, and there's a variety of different units within Army SOF, and a lot of people don't actually truly understand that. And I love it when people are like, "Oh, what did you do?" And I say, "Oh, I was a Green Beret." And they say, "Is that like a Navy SEAL?" It's like, no. And then you realize that you're never they're just not gonna understand that. And so you say, yes, it's like a Navy SEAL in the Army. But
no, I would never surrender that. In fact, that's usually my opportunity to launch into a tutorial on the difference between Green Berets and Navy SEALs,
huge difference,
and everything else.
But I wanna ask you about that difference, because they have different missions.
Right.
And when you command an organization like this where everybody's good, I mean, certainly every organization has some bad apples, but I mean, by and large, everybody is at the top of their game. They all want to get in the fight. They all want to support the nation's mission. They all want to be the first one in and the last one out. When you sit on top of an organization like this and you start to really have to think about lanes and roles and responsibilities, how did you look at Green Berets versus Rangers? And then also, I want to ask you kind of about civil affairs and Psyops and their missions. But let's start with Green Berets, Rangers, and how you assess those organizations.
Yeah, I think it really is important to understand that essentially they're different tools for different jobs, right? I mean the Rangers and you can roll in the Navy SEALs and some of the other forces that are similar that are very much out of the commando mode, right? They are a straight up the middle direct action force, right? And their job is to do, take the hard target, go after a critical node, but it's very much a direct action. We're going to do something directly against an enemy capability, whether it's a piece of infrastructure, a person. They're face-to-face focused on the enemy and destroying his capabilities in some ways. Green Berets are almost unique in that they are focused by and large on changing something in the human domain. We're focused on a partner.
Mm-hmm.
We achieve effects on the battlefield or even before war breaks out in a environment to use the indigenous partners that we find and leverage to create an effect. Example, early days of Iraq invasion, a couple of SF battalions out of the 10th group working with Kurdish Peshmerga, about 50,000 in total,
Mm-hmm.
to hold 2/3 of the Iraqi army that was positioned in the north, up in the north. So the invasion force coming out of Kuwait deals with fewer forces.
Right.
Right. I mean, that is, so we don't have the combat power to hold 13 Iraqi divisions in place. We got to find the combat power somewhere. We leverage the population, this Peshmerga force, essentially a paramilitary organization, to help us accomplish our mission.
Hmm.
And that's our approach everywhere we go, in a sort of a crude way to say it's, remember Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer,
Mm-hmm.
right? Gets in trouble with Aunt Polly. He's got to paint the fence on a Saturday morning. What does he do? He figures out how to encourage all his buddies to paint the fence for him.
It's about influence.
SF guys are kind of that way.
Yeah.
I mean, it's how do we leverage others to help us paint the fence, particularly if it's their fence to paint. Right?
Yeah.
They've got objectives here too. The Kurds in the north of Iraq had objectives. They aligned with ours, and Green Berets do that around the world. We're working in this human domain, first to characterize it, to understand what's going on at the micro tactical level, develop influence with various segments of society, and then use that influence to create partnerships that allow us to achieve U.S. objectives.
As the concept of by, with, and through. Yeah. And I think that when we look at what you learn being a Green Beret about those, leveraging those relationships, understanding people, meeting people where they are, in an ability to influence them towards a common goal, those lessons translate into anything that you do outside of the military, leading any organization.
So going back to your question about, what force for what role, it's important to understand that these are specialized capabilities, special operations forces, right? They're focused for a specific purpose. And so it even starts at selection and assessment for all the different tribes, as we sometimes colloquially refer to them as. Hey, we're looking for a certain kind of individual for these direct action forces. They're more than willing to lead the charge up the hill, to be the first guy at the door of the building before they enter. Green Berets have got to be able to do the skills of that, but really are willing to do the hard work to do the same task sometimes in a different way. Mm-hmm. I need to create a partner. I need to teach my partner how to go in the door. I need to teach my partner how to accomplish this raid, ambush, whatever it might be. And it's a lot harder in a lot of ways, but it also, it creates what we call indigenous mass, right? Mm-hmm. It takes a small number of U.S. Green Berets to put much more capability on the battlefield, but also do it in a way that often is more appropriate to the environment. It's the indigenous people solving their problems instead of a whole bunch of Americans coming in and taking over.
And there's sustainability in that over time too.
Right.
Yeah.
A perfect Green Beret mission looks like going to a complex environment, developing some ways to solve it through an indigenous partner, that you create the capability that they not only can deal with the situation today, but that they're sustainable over time, so that we can leave and they can still be an agent of stability in their own country without our help. Mm-hmm. That would be perfect, right?
What about Psyops and civil affairs?
Right. Actually, much of the current modern day Army SOF enterprise here at Fort Bragg started really with the psychological operations. When you look at what came out of World War II, the Jedburghs, the OSS, but a big component was this belief that you had to influence the thought process, the cognitive domain. And so the practitioners of the 50s who were getting ready to, or already in the struggle of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, understood that the cognitive aspect was important, particularly to try and influence populations behind the Iron Curtain, et cetera. So the whole RSOF enterprise started first with recreating some of the psychological operations capability, and then created the guerrilla warfare aspect by recreating, what had been the Jedburghs and some of the other capabilities with SF, with Green Beret Special Forces. So their role really comes down to wield information tools in this cognitive struggle. I mean, in the end, war is a cognitive struggle. It's convincing an adversary to not fight. We call it deterrence. Undermine, if we do come to conflict, try and undermine their capability to carry the fight to a successful conclusion, to convince their population not to support their government. All of these are cognitive acts, and the job of the psychological operations community is to understand the human domain to a sufficient level to be able to craft messages and themes and narratives that achieve a military effect, undermining, deterring, et cetera.
And I mean, look at the environment today, and we talk a lot about information warfare. We talk about the abundance of information that lives in our environment. Back in the day, I guess, World War II and throughout the last 50 years, we didn't have the amount of technology that sits in our hands over the last 20 years and the evolution that we've made. And now information is so present in such mass that these types of influence operations become so much more critical.
Absolutely. And a big part of that is not just quantity and volume, it's also the access and reach, right? So in warfare of past, I mean, the nature hasn't changed. It's always got this cognitive aspect of, I've got to convince my enemy that he's defeated. And in days past, armies invaded nations. They occupied them, put their boot on the neck, if you will, and said, give. Right. But you had to get them to that cognitive realization that fighting further is not going to be successful. We need to surrender. We need to appeal, negotiate, et cetera. But you had to first occupy so that you had the access to transmit your message to the enemy population, enemy leadership, et cetera. You can actually now reach into your adversary, as our adversaries have done to us, to try and message within our information environment to achieve their objectives, whether it's to sow discontent in American society, undermine credibility of leaders, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not the end all be all, because most societies have a level of resilience, but it can certainly achieve some effects. One could imagine the Russians using information operations inside this country to sow enough discontent that we would be hesitant, perhaps, to fulfill our NATO obligations in the Baltic states where they invaded, or perhaps that we would limit our support in the ongoing Ukraine confrontation. You could argue that's already happened, right? I mean,
I would agree with that.
Putin's got the ability to speak almost directly to the American people. Our news media carries his pronouncements. There are also, there's an army of Russian trolls out there on our internet who are putting in blog comments and everything else to try and limit how much the U.S. does in support of Ukraine. All of that wasn't possible before the digital age and level of connectivity. I mean, you think post-World War, World War II, we had Voice of America, Radio Free Europe. We had ways to transmit some messages in that had effect.
Right.
But the order of magnitude of our capability now is just vast compared to Radio Free Europe, for example.
Yeah.
And then the last one you asked about, I'm sorry, unless you want to.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say is the civil affairs. So the civil affairs in the broad conventional sense exists, because there's more than just what lives in the Army Special Ops community, is essentially a force that is designed to help deconflict and mitigate the impact of military operations on the civilian populace where we're operating. The civil affairs within the RSOF community are a bit more specialized than that, right? They're part of this triad, if you will, of Green Berets, psychological operations, and civil affairs that operate within the human domain. And what the civil affairs can do is help us characterize and map what the existing social structures are in a place we might need to operate, to understand, for example, groups that might be adequate resistance potential in the case of Green Berets having to do an unconventional warfare operation after somebody invades. Another hypothetical. So perhaps you want to prepare for potential Russian invasion of a country that's currently a friendly nation. You might be able to use the civil affairs to understand social structures like hunt clubs, what their current civil defense network looks like, how do their emergency services operate, all things that the Green Berets will need to understand in order to leverage that as a resistance force and resistance architecture in case the Russians invade and occupy. But it also feeds this societal understanding for the psychological operators to be able to pursue effective narratives. So there is a synergy between these three organizations.
Well, soft imperative number one is understand your operational environment.
There you go.
Because if you don't know, you can't understand fundamentally what's driving people's perspectives in their region. You're never going to get there.
For us, if you looked at let's go back to the 82nd. If the 82nd is going to go do an operation somewhere, they will focus largely in their planning process and their study on the enemy force they're going to operate against. What are their capabilities, what's their dispositions, where are they, where aren't they not, what's their level of morale, training, etc. We'll do some of that too, but a large part of what this RSOF team will do is focus, what's the nature of society? What makes people tick? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? What are the fissures? And in some cases, if we're trying to support that society or the government there, we're going to figure out what are the weaknesses that we can help mitigate? What are the strengths we can, take advantage of and accentuate? If perhaps we're in that reverse role of an unconventional warfare environment, we're trying to overthrow an occupying or oppressive power, we're going to look for those weaknesses and fissures in society and figure out how to drive a truck through them.
Right. Which is a very important part of what the Green Berets are doing. And we've seen that, all over the world, and we haven't seen that in a lot of places too, because we haven't really talked about it. But what about the 160th? Because we had General Hutmacher on in episode 17, and as it was easily one of our top episodes, because I joked with him that, and you said at the beginning you wanted to be a pilot, but everybody loves helicopters.
Yeah. So Clay Hutmacher and I have a long association. In fact, he was my deputy at Army Special Operations Command for 2 years. And we have a very close and I won't say confrontational, but a good back and forth, between the two of us and our aides. There was a constant, running prank session going. I mean, we could spend hours talking about, I looked up one day in my office and there's a ceiling tile been covered over with a picture of Clay Hutmacher. We paid him back for that in spades, but I'll just say, it was that kind of environment. So I love Clay Hutmacher. He's great. I'm sure he was an awesome podcast
he's got the best voice,
because he can just tell a story. He's funny, he's engaging, and just don't put us in the file next to each other.
Yeah,
because I can't do as much as Clay. But hey, so the 160 is our really the premier helicopter pilots in the world.
Yeah.
And their job is to get special operators to where they need to go and get them out again. And they can do it in the worst of conditions, both from, weather, darkness, terrain, enemy capabilities. They're designed essentially to penetrate enemy airspace if need be, and put an SF team behind the lines or a group of Rangers or other commandos on the X, if you will, land them on the spot they're targeting, and then when their job is done, bring them out.
I called it one of the greatest projections of combat power that the world has ever seen.
Yeah. I mean, it really is an incredible capability now, and it doesn't exist alone, right? I mean, you really have to, all of our capabilities exist within this broader network of the joint force under the Special Operations Command in Tampa. The 160th helicopters are limited by range unless they have the Air Force refuelers to also penetrate, refuel them in midair, and extend their legs. So it's a symbiotic relationship in the SOF community. Everybody's got their piece that they're responsible for. Kind of going back to the earlier question of how do you figure out who does what. The challenge we have sometimes is we get to this belief that any of the SOF tribes can do anything.
Yeah.
Right. This idea that we're fungible. Right. Good people can figure out the mission. To some extent, it's true. Right. I mean, we recruit for intelligence, complex problem solving, and a bunch of different characteristics. And so I can throw a Green Beret at a problem that really is more designed for a Ranger, and they'll figure it out. But why would I do that? Because they'll have to train up to do this specialized capability. And so it really is a function of making sure that our enthusiasm and desire to be employed, because all of our special operators, regardless of tribe, have a kind of a bias to action. They signed up because they want to go do something.
They're looking for work.
They want to be employed, right? But we just need to, part of the leadership's job is to make sure that we employ the right person and unit to the right task, suitable to what they're designed for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I joked about the SEALs earlier, and we saw a lot of that bleed over with, Green Berets and SEAL teams, and they thought, okay, well, you can, plug any soft unit, into that training mission, and you're going to have the same effect. And, and you had some effect and similar effect. I wouldn't say that you always had the same effect or the effect that you were generally looking for, because they're not necessarily transferable. And it's just like you don't take a Green Beret team and necessarily have them do, underwater demolitions at the same capability.
And part of that was a function of the requirements of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? We had more task than we had units for. And so, I commanded the Siege of Soda on 2 tours in Iraq in 06 and then again in 07. So essentially a bunch of SF teams, civil affairs, Psyops, and Navy SEALs spread across Iraq, 60 different locations, doing a variety of missions that we can talk about if you care. But really what you needed was 3 SF battalions, because it was very much this human domain centric mission: characterize, understand the environment, develop partners, and employ those partners out to target networks. Well, we didn't have enough SF battalions at the same time as we were fighting in Afghanistan.
Right.
And so the 3rd SF battalion was frequently a similar sized organization of Navy SEALs.
Yeah.
Now, Navy SEALs very much part of that direct action commando force. And now they're put in a role where we expect them to create partners, develop Iraqi capabilities, whether it's a SWAT team or a commando-like element or whatever it is they've been asked to do. And it's not what they've been designed for. It's not what they were selected and assessed and recruited for. Now they're doing this, as we call it, FID, Foreign Internal Defense, is a 4-letter word.
Yeah.
It's messy, right? It sticks to your shoes sometimes,
it does.
Right? And it's hard. It's a painful way sometimes to achieve objectives by doing it through somebody else. And to some extent, we put the wrong tool to the job. They did a great job in a lot of ways because they had to adapt to it. They changed the character of their training cycle to meet this requirement. So they adapted organizationally to do the task because we didn't have enough of the purpose-built organizations to do it instead. In the next conflict, I think Navy SEALs will be back to more core tasks of, maritime, underwater, et cetera. And I would expect SF units to not be doing those things. Although we do have, some level of maritime capability. Hey, if I have a maritime mission that requires a small team to go do a precise thing, I want Navy SEALs.
Yeah, all day long.
Right. If I need somebody to go work with an indigenous partner and create indigenous mass, develop networks, characterize an environment, work inside this messy human domain, I want Green Berets.
And there's great examples of that. I mean, think about in the invasion of Afghanistan, and the horse soldiers that we were talking about earlier. Perfect Green Beret mission. The rescue of Captain Phillips on the Maersk, Alabama is and the halo onto the destroyer and the sniper engagement. I mean, those are textbook examples that you watch and even with your experience and your years in service, you still look at and you get goosebumps and you're like, wow, incredible.
I can reach in my toolbox and bash a screw into a piece of wood with my hammer. It was really designed to be done with a screwdriver.
Yep.
Right. That's what we do sometimes when we have to, exigencies of war, et cetera. But when all other things being equal, we should use the right tool for the job.
Absolutely. You commanded SOF units prior to 9/11 and after 9/11, and you were a huge part and an instrumental part of the evolution of all of these units that we just talked about throughout that time and throughout the global war on terror. Can you talk about your vision for Army SOF as the commander when you commanded USASOC, and what was that evolution? How did 9/11 and the global war on terror really transform the priorities of SOF?
Yeah. So I started my Special Forces career, young captain, late 80s in Bad Tolz, Germany. I had gone to the Q course in 87, went to Defense Language Institute to learn Polish. I already had German from school, and went to a unit, 1st Battalion, 10th Group, forward deployed in Germany that had a Cold War mission, to literally put teams across Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain in the event of World War III. And so, my SF career started off with a big binder. That was the mission book for our team to go to a spot and parachute into a spot in Poland, take out a target, to facilitate the air campaign against second and third echelons of Soviets coming out of the East. And then we were supposed to raise guerrilla armies in Eastern Europe, in Poland for our case.
It's like a couple of days of work.
Yeah. Highly survivable.
Yeah, you definitely make it.
Yeah. I won't say it was a suicide mission, but it sure seemed like that. Anyway, and then, during my time in Germany, soon after really I got there, the wall comes down. Essentially, the Soviet Union falls, Desert Shield storm. We got involved in that. But we went through this, I started my SOF career, my SF career, in an era of what we now call great power competition, right? It was the Cold War. It was us and the Soviet Union in a very bipolar world. And then through the 90s, it was kind of the messy aftermath of the dissolution of this bipolar world. You saw, Yugoslavia fall apart. I spent a lot of time in the Balkans. And then, 9/11 comes. And so 9/11 obviously changed the next 20 years for everybody.
Where were you? Because I asked about Bill because everyone's story is so impactful to them.
So Fort Carson.
Very well.
We were down in the ISAFAC of the 10th Group facility where we had our battalion headquarters set up for an exercise. We had teams deployed into Wyoming and Montana. We were running a Battalion X. And literally on that morning, there was not a TV in the JOC. Of course, today, these days, we don't have a headquarters without a TV in it.
Got 17 TVs.
Yeah.
It's just a wall of TVs channels, in there now.
Videos and everything else. ISR videos, but we didn't have a TV on in there, but there was one over in one of the other offices in that ISAFAC, right where you enter, if you remember. And one of the guys came in and said, "Hey, sir, you got to see this. A plane just hit the World Trade Center." And so in the tiny little office, now everybody is crowded around watching this thing. And of course we watched the second strike. And I will say, we did the same thing everybody else did. We were glued to the TV for really all morning talking about it. And that afternoon we started planning. Literally, we changed, we were in this planning configuration for this exercise, but I said, okay, look, where do we think this came from? And it was either Iraq or Afghanistan.
Right.
And, we kind of said, okay, if it's Afghanistan, that's going to be 5th Group because that's their AOR. And if it's Iraq, it's also 5th Group, but we had history in the North. Mm-hmm. Let's start pulling out all the old files on what we did previously with the Kurds up in northern Iraq, maps, et cetera, who in the unit had experience there. And we started studying. And we probably did that for the first week. And then it became apparent that it was going to be Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. So we sort of pause-X'd on that. And then by that late winter, spring of 2004, we already knew there was a pivot to Iraq coming.
Right.
And we were all Iraq all the time, really, for the next 10 or 15 years.
And how did Iraq then kind of change the organization? Because you then led 10th Group at a number of different levels.
Yeah, so I was a battalion commander at that time. So, about 350, 400 folks at the 9/11 period. And then led that battalion under the auspices of our group headquarters, commanded by Charlie Cleveland, Colonel then, who was my predecessor at USASOC. Mm-hmm. Years down the road. But so he was, he commanded the overall operation in the North. I was one of his subordinate commanders. And we focused for months on our role in the invasion. As I mentioned before, it was how do we keep 13 divisions, 2 corps of the Iraqi army in the North so they don't interfere with the invasion. And we essentially infiltrated northern Iraq, met with our partners. In my sector, we also had an Al-Qaeda affiliated terrorist organization that was really what the Kurds really cared about. Right. That we had to deal with first, a group called Ansar al-Islam, affiliated with Al-Qaeda, that we had to take out first. And then, we fought the war with our Kurdish counterparts, accomplished the mission. Went home, high-fived, successful operation. We were fortunate to not have anybody killed in action. Mm-hmm. Few folks, minor wounds. But by the time we left, you could also already see the seeds of a potential insurgency coming. And the group was back there within, I think, 6 or 8 months. I left command, right. Went on to SOCOM, and by the time I came back 2 years later as the group commander, the group had already had a couple of rotations during the insurgency phase. So when I went back in early 2006, I was commanding the overall group and all the attachments with it that formed what we called the CGSOT of the Combined Special Operations Task Force Arabian Peninsula. And we were on a head-to-toe rotation with 5th Group. Yeah. And in that role, we were very much in the counterinsurgency fight, developing Iraqi partners to execute the fight, running operations to characterize the environment and understand our adversaries.
And who was influencing who were the adversaries? Right. I think, that was the toughest part. I went there 3 times, twice mm-hmm. in 10th Group and once as a platoon leader in the infantry before that. And so many times it was about who are we fighting?
Right. Because at any given time, it wasn't just Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Right. There were dozens, literally, of Sunni-affiliated groups that shared some level of common objective in that they hated us. Mm-hmm. Although then the Civil War started, and they really hated the Shia militias more than they hated us in mm-hmm. many ways, which allowed us to eventually pull some of them away from Al-Qaeda. But we were also creating these Iraqi units to target them, and I think one of the little known but really most strategically important things accomplished in Iraq was the creation of the Iraqi Special Operations Force, which was essentially a purely Green Beret creation that developed really the most capable and credible special operations capability in all of the Middle East. And they prosecuted the war with our advice and assistance during our presence there. And then when we left in end of 2011, and then ISIS came to town, really Al-Qaeda in Iraq version 2. The only thing that saved Iraq as a nation was the ISOF.
Yeah.
It was the only force that actually stood and fought, and it was the military force that led the reconquest of all the occupied territory that followed.
I have about 16 months with the 6th Regional Commando Battalion down in Basra. Right. So that was my partner force for 2 back-to-back rotations down there.
Yeah. So, we you see some of this hand wringing after the Iraq and Afghanistan experiences in national security circles about, working through partners doesn't work. We really can't create partner forces, et cetera, et cetera. And that is incredibly false. The bottom line is I point to ISOF every time and other examples around the world, around Green Beret history. You can do it, but it's really hard work. And you actually have to focus your full attention on creating the partner as opposed to doing it as a side job or, expecting them to be at the rear end of your column and learning by doing, so to speak. It's to really create a sustaining partner. You need to create a combat capability. You need to create their own assessment, selection, training, education, logistics, all those things that make a force. You got to do the whole package or else it's not sustainable.
And they bled.
Oh yeah.
Right alongside, some of our guys, but I mean, we lost guys in that unit.
Oh, and, by far. I mean, and I always tried to emphasize to our folks partnered with the Iraqi SOF and our other partners that we created there. Hey, your goal is to continually move back in the stack, right? You may need to be the number one man when we start with this partner force, because they need to watch you do it and because they don't have the confidence in their skills yet. But at some point, you need to be the number 4, 5 man. And eventually, you should be able to stay 100 meters off target and watch the Iraqis do it and help them and bring in ISR and close air support, et cetera, so that it's Iraqi lives fighting for Iraq, not American lives leading the charge.
Yeah.
They definitely bled.
Through this evolution of SOF, and you also had, during this time, I mean, just massive amounts of, high operational tempo for the 160th.
Yeah, everybody.
Rangers doing 90 on, 3 months on,
other
6
special mission
months
unit
off.
Capability there. I mean, everybody was all in.
What effect do you assess that had on the force in 2 ways? I think a lot of people will ask this question and they'll say, on the health and the preservation of the force certainly is a big issue. And I want to talk about mental health later on when we talk about Green Beret Foundation, but also just the amount of reps that an organization takes by doing this. Their level of proficiency increased so much throughout the last 20 years.
Yeah, the U.S. Army as a whole has a really good methodology for training. We've got national training centers that try and replicate as much as you can in a training environment, the realities of combat. But it's only an image of reality. It's not reality. But when you actually then get into a combat environment and you're dealing with all the different factors that are involved and the realities of a thinking adversary, who is trying to kill you, you learn, right? You learn or die. And the military as a whole, but certainly our community really sharpened our skills. And I think regardless of, Green Berets, JSOC, whoever it was, I think we had TTPs that we had developed in training that were based on previous combat experiences, operational experiences. But until you actually get into that particular environment against that particular enemy, you don't know what's going to work and what's not going to work. And part of the magic of our community is we learn quickly and constantly. It's a constant self-assessment to say, hey, we went out and did an operation tonight. We succeeded in doing X, Y, and Z, which we were trying to do, but A, B, and C happened to us that we didn't anticipate. How do we change that? Mm-hmm. What went right? What went wrong? It's this ability to self-critique and say, we can do better. Even when things go swimmingly, we can do better. And I think that's what that cauldron, if you will, of being in a combat environment for 20 years, just forced, as you said, an incredible amount of advancement and learning. And now our challenge is, and how do we maintain that as we don't have that same environment, and we have a whole new generation of folks coming into force that didn't have the experience.
Right. And how do you not get complacent too during that time? Because, as and I think as a commander, you fought this a lot. I fought this a lot. As guys are, in some regards, they're not necessarily wrong. They're coming in and they're like, I've been here 5 times. I've been here 6 times.
One of the things we emphasized, because we're in this head-to-toe rotation, right? It's essentially you're home for 6 months, training, a little bit of rest after the last rotation, take some leave.
Yeah, take the weekend off.
Take a little bit more than a couple of weeks. It was more than that. But and then you're back into training for the next rotation.
Yeah.
And you're right. You've got to fight against this. Okay, let's train against what we just left.
Right.
As opposed to understanding, and we always found this when you got back to Iraq on the next tour for 8 months, because it was 6 off, 8 on, essentially, with the overlaps. It was a different environment every time you came back.
Oh, absolutely.
Something had changed in the environment, and sometimes it was significant. One time you leave and we're running ops all over Iraq at our own decision.
Right.
We decide time, place, whether we do it or not. And then you come back the next tour and all of a sudden you find out that, hey, the Iraqi government decided that they're in charge and sovereign. And now we have to involve them in the process. And how are we going to do that? While we're still guarding, operational security, et cetera. We went from essentially military operations to evidence-driven law enforcement. Like, hey, you can't just go pick the guy up. I've got to have evidence. I'm going to an Iraqi court to get a warrant.
Oh yeah, the judges had to sign off on it. The commanders.
The way, it's no longer really a military environment. If I'm going to have success in picking up, Abu bad guy off the streets, I need to keep him away in the prison system. That means I got to get him through the Iraqi criminal court, which means now I got to know how to collect evidence in a way and present a case, much like law enforcement does traditionally. So every time you came back, the environment had changed. And what we ended up getting into was, hey, how do we, in the off rotation, stay connected with the guys who replaced us? And we started doing VTCs every week, reports back and forth to really stay connected to the mission so that they could help you feed your training cycle as they saw the changes that were coming. But it comes back to what you talked before. Hey, the first off imperative is understand your operational environment. And you got to understand it's a dynamic environment. And this applies to anything, right, in life. Nothing is static. If you're a businessman, you've got to be in tune with your operational environment and how does it change, whether it's because of something catastrophic like a pandemic or a recession, et cetera. But even in the best of times, my market is changing.
Right, all the time.
My customers changing, right? Needs, wants, desires are changing. How do I stay attuned to that to anticipate what is the change's effect going to be on my business? In our case, it was, what's the change going to be on our military operations and how do we organize, train, equip, et cetera?
Well, so you talked about the feedback loop. You talked about the ability to look inward, understand what worked, what didn't. So now I'm gonna ask you, as you look back on the global war on terror, and I've said before, that the war on terror is not over. And anybody who thinks that it is over is living in a different planet.
Unfortunately, it's almost the background noise in the environment that is global strategic great power, whatever you want to call it, competition with the Chinese, the Russians, et cetera. It's just an aspect of the environment now.
Right, and it still exists.
But we still have to take it into account and do something about it.
What do we get right from SOF during this time? What do we do really well?
From my perspective, I will tell you, I go back to things like the ISOF or the commandos over in Afghanistan. We really did a good job in partnering with and developing these capabilities out of indigenous, create indigenous mass out of the population. Creating ISOF commandos from an off-the-street recruiting program, and then putting them through the process and creating really preeminent warriors for Iraq. What it also validated to me, though, from a soft perspective, really a Green Beret perspective, is that the quiet work we do outside the combat zone pays as many or more dividends as what we do when we get employed. And I'll give you an example. Both Iraq and Afghanistan were not U.S. unilateral operations, particularly from the soft perspective. We had partners from around the world with us. For example, in Iraq, I had, teams from across all the groups because they were partnered with, first group had a team up north because the Koreans were there.
Right.
Seventh group had a constant rotation with us because there was a battalion out of El Salvador down in the south. If you look at the Afghanistan picture, we had all kinds of partners from Europe, particularly, but others. The UAE came to join. All the Eastern European countries had their SOF there, Western European as well. And I talk about this kind of quiet campaigning work that we do over time, but some of our best partners in Afghanistan from a special ops perspective were the Eastern Europeans who, when the wall came down, we trained, developed, and in many cases created the organizations with them during the 90s, during Partnership for Peace. So we had these constant rotations back and forth from 10th Group to go do a JSET here in Poland with the GROM, or go to this country and help them stand up a special operations capability. And so you look at that quiet peacetime work, if you will, that yields partners on a battlefield in Afghanistan and Iraq 10, 15 years later. That's magic.
Yeah.
And it's not something that we highlight often as to the value of Green Berets, right? It's because everybody can tell a war story, particularly after the last 20 years. and it really focuses you on the pointy end of the spear, combat actions, which is really such a small part of a Green Beret's life cycle. Most of our time is spent in places like Colombia, helping them develop capability against the FARC, or Peru, or any of these many countries around the world, or even in places that don't have an internal threat. As I mentioned, the Eastern Europeans, no real internal threat in the 90s, but we were there already helping them make units and capabilities that they would help us with later when the time came.
It's the shaping operation.
Absolutely. It's an investment. I call it an investment strategy.
Oh, you're right.
So you came out of the investment world, right?
Yeah.
It's an investment. I'm putting money, time, and energy into something today, into a partnership today, with the hope that there will, if need be, maybe not the hope, because we didn't want to, want to go to Afghanistan, but when I needed it later on, that investment paid off.
Yeah.
And that's the way I look at most of what Green Berets do. We're an investment strategy. We're creating networks, relationships, we're creating a body of knowledge, and we're creating partner capabilities as a hedge against an uncertain future when they might be needed.
Yeah, look at Ukraine.
Absolutely. So, Ukraine. We've been working with the Ukrainians well before the Russian invasion in 14. But since 14, there's been a persistent 24/7, 365 effort, not just Green Berets, conventional as well, but certainly Green Berets, working with Ukrainians to both kind of transition from a Soviet type legacy model of their military, particularly in their SOF, that was very commando focused, and build this idea of a resistance mentality. Use small amount of SOF, can leverage your population to be a larger resistance element against a Russian invasion. And you saw that investment strategy pay off when the Russians invaded again last year, or this year, I guess.
The Ukrainian men were taking their families to the border and coming back to join the resistance.
And I'll tell you that by all reports, I'm a retiree now, so I know what I read and what people tell me. But by all reports, that SF effort to instill this resistance capability, as well as some psychological and civil affairs work with them, really paid dividends. And we don't get that from Green Berets patting themselves on the back. It's from Ukrainian SOF sending videos and messages back over Signal and Telegram to the guys that they were associated with at a 10th group and some of the other, National Guard groups saying, hey, all that stuff you taught us is paying off.
Yeah.
Watch how we did this. Watch what we're doing in action. So, and that's, that's the best endorsement of the approach, I think, is when the partner says, hey, you made a difference with what you invested in us.
Yeah, that's impact. What do we leave on the table? What would we miss?
There were periods of time where I think in probably in both theaters where we got a little too focused on enemy action, right?
Yeah.
Controlling for action, fighting at the tactical level, and not enough on the partner. And I think collectively as a military, we never really answered the question of how do we turn tactical success into operational and strategic outcomes for the nation. You look at all those years in Iraq, for example, and you got to say, how did it's not a lost cause by any case. Certainly, it's not Afghanistan with the Taliban in charge, but all that investment in Iraq didn't exactly yield what we hoped, which was going to be a solid U.S. partner, a democratic nation focused on, helping the rest of the Middle East understand a different way of working. And I think some of that's on us, big M military, a little bit too focused on the narrow task of defeat the insurgent in the field. And I'll say there was a lot of work, a lot of effort to try and support social structure and rebuilding, et cetera. But in the end, we probably needed more of that, right? This is a human dynamic. We're trying to rebuild a country here in a new way, and taking care of Al-Qaeda in Iraq was, and all the other insurgent groups and the Shia militias, those were all important, necessary things to do, but they were not sufficient. And I think we lost the connection to how do we turn tactical victory into a strategic outcome?
Yeah, when you talk about that, I'm reminded of a conversation I had with General Peter Corelli, where he talks about the whole of government approach.
One of my bosses on my 06 tour.
But his perspective is,
man.
we missed on the whole of government approach, where we were still so siloed in DOD does this, State Department does this, intelligence agencies do this, and we never really came together at the strategic level and said, this is how we actually affect a goal 10, 20, 30 years down the road.
I would say yes, certainly at the strategic level, which I would classify as, back in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, but he does too.
Where we lacked that synchronization of the dime, right? Diplomatic, informational, military, economic, all the tools of national power wielded in a strategic way against a strategic plan to achieve outcomes over the long term. At the local level, what I'd call high tactical operational, I thought the interagency really did over time work well together.
Right.
I mean, the embassy team and the military team were sitting in the same rooms, trying to solve the same problems, trying to play to each other's strengths. So you got that, but you're right. To some extent, you've got to ask yourself, why did we not get the outcomes we wanted? I don't know that we ever defined them in a strategy, right? My take on our experience in the Middle East for the last 20 years is that we fought a tactical action. We never really had a strategy that answered the question of what do we want this to look like at some future point, right? It's this whole operational design, right? I'm in a current state. I am not satisfied with current state.
Right.
I have to understand it, but I also have to envision the future state I want to move towards. And then I've got to devise stratagems and resource them to get from today to this future state and change the environment. And I don't think we ever really envisioned at the strategic level, what do we want this to look like when it's all over? At a level of fidelity that was something beyond, we want it to be peaceful and stable in the Middle East. I mean, that's not workable as a path, as something that you can shoot a path to.
Yeah, that's a lofty goal, but that's not a quantifiable metric that we work towards.
It's the old saw, right? If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there.
Right.
And we just didn't have a path towards a future success.
Yeah.
And part of it is because, to some extent, that's got to come from the national strategic level. And guys like General Corelli and Petraeus and others that were in command tried to take on developing that picture, but in the end, they don't own all the resources to guide the nation. And that's the other thing we forgot was war is a national effort, not a military effort.
Yep.
And it takes the nation to commit to a future.
Yeah.
We won the Cold War because the nation was committed to the effort and to a strategy that said, our very existence is threatened by the Soviet Union, and we're gonna take a strategy of deterrence and eventually undermining the Soviet Union through a lot of ways, but that we were committed to a goal.
Well, let me ask you this, because you went there. I wasn't planning on going there, but I got to ask you now. That when you look back on history and you look at efforts, World War II, World War I, the Cold War, to an extent, the first Gulf War, and then you compare those efforts against Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, it's clear when you mobilize the national effort and when everything about your national identity becomes about winning at all costs, we win every time. When we've gone in, let's devote some effort to this. Let's not mobilize the populace. Let's not, which we did after 9/11. I mean, we had that, and three teams won that war. We messed it up after that.
But we didn't really mobilize the nation.
As an economy and everything.
I think President Bush did a lot of things right.
Yeah.
But I'll never forget that comment about, the job of the American people is to get back to their life as normal. Mm-hmm. It was, return to the malls, go back, whatever. But it almost came off as, we've got a military to fight this war, this global war on terrorism. You can go back to your life. And to me, that was a fatal flaw that didn't keep the commitment we had on 9/11 and 12.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Mobilized and focused. The population's got to be mobilized to the effort.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the job of national leadership. And they've got to be made to feel part of the effort. One of the you look at World War II and the Victory Garden and the aluminum drive, and whether or not and bonds and everything, some of that was actually necessary action to fuel the war effort. Mm-hmm. But I think some of it was merely to involve everybody and touch everybody and make them feel a part of the overall drive to victory. That's mobilizing a population. And we didn't do that for the war on terror. We did exactly the opposite. We said, you don't need to change your life. You can live the way you were on 9/10 and return to that.
Will we learn?
Part of it is I would imagine a judgment at the national level on any of these efforts of, is this an existential threat that we need to mobilize the nation for? Whether it's Vietnam or the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, arguably they made because mobilizing the nation and all those aspects of power against this threat is a commitment, and it involves choices, and it may sacrifice other priorities, et cetera. So I can understand the trade-offs and the balances.
Yeah.
But it kind of goes back to Colin Powell of, hey, if you're going to commit the military, you ought to be you ought to be serious about winning. The Powell doctrine, right? Yeah. Now I don't know that I agree that every problem means that the answer is an overwhelming armored fist. Yeah.
General Schwarzkopf leading
right.
tanks.
There are other ways, once again, we come out of that community that believes there are other ways, often with other people's resources to answer problems. but it still requires the nation to be committed to the task and put those other levers of power into play. And I think in many ways the judgment was it was not an overall existential threat to the nation.
Can I show you a video?
Sure.
This video was just released by 10th Group, and I want to show it to you and talk about it here. What does it mean to be a Green Beret in the U.S. Army Special Forces?
Yeah. So I've actually seen that video a couple times now. And every time I watch it, I want to join.
Me too. Start over.
35 years. I want it. Yeah. I think that's a magnificent way to describe a lot of things. But I guess to me, it means, at the core, I used to tell people that being a Green Beret is to live a life of gravitas. You do things that make a real difference for the nation, for the people you're working with, and you capture some of that in there. I love the line of, I never wanted my kids to look up to somebody else. It's magic. I mean, it really is.
Yeah.
And it comes down to this, to me, I think this idea of gravitas. You're doing things that are going to make a difference in the history of the nation. It's hard life. It is truly a lifestyle choice. But, I had a chance to be at the Special Forces Association convention last week, celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Green Berets, and give the keynote speech at the dinner. And one of the things I talked about was Green Berets, Special Forces, are not a break glass in time of war force. Sitting at home station, training, waiting for the call. They're employed day in, day out for pretty much all their 70 years. They're doing what we talked about before, this quiet work of preparing and investing so that the nation has different options in case of crisis. Right? And some of them never come to play. Some of the investments don't ever get called in. But it's the knowledge that you've done things on behalf of the nation that will make a difference if needed.
You talked about wanting to join, and we did. We served. That allegiance to the regiment will exist because it defines so much of who we are. But unfortunately, We have to pass
Our
that
time has come
to the next
and gone.
generation. We talk about character a lot in the podcast. It's a foundational element. We talk about these 9 characteristics that SOF uses: drive, resiliency, adaptability, humility, integrity, curiosity, team ability, effective intelligence, emotional strength. You mentioned a number of these in the last couple of minutes as we've been talking. Each one of our SOF units uses different variations of these to recruit within their ranks.
And to assess, to make sure we're getting the right person.
When you think about assessment of building these teams, when you think about what you look for in your teams, why are these characteristics so important? Because there's so many different that we could choose from. But what is it that defines these, and why does SOF use them in their assessment?
It's a couple things, I guess. First, I'd say it's the basic premise, and I think this is really across much of SOF. Certainly, it's common across the Army's Special Operations community, is that the person is the weapon system, right? We're not manning a tank, a plane, a ship, and putting people trained to fight that weapon system. We arm the man or woman, hopefully with the right technology and the equipment they need to do their job and facilitate it. But in the end, we're trying to assess and select a complex problem solver, somebody who we can put into a really messy, difficult environment, who does what no technology yet can do, which is understand and characterize this complex environment of human emotions, ideologies, challenges, and come out with an appropriate solution to achieve a national objective. And I think at the core, all of those characteristics then build towards this capability of the right kind of person that I can trust to put into this environment, because it's often far away from the watchful eye of a senior leader. You know, we always come back to, in the last 20 years, of what we did in Iraq or Afghanistan, but at the same time as those were going on, we were still doing this quiet work of campaigning elsewhere, in which case you often have 10 or 12 Green Berets in a country who report to the embassy. There is no higher leadership. It's a 25 or 28-year-old captain, a warrant officer, and 10 NCOs, all generally in their 20s, maybe young, early 30s, who are literally the face of the U.S. military in this country to solve a complex problem. And if you don't have those skills or those characteristics in your personality, you're not armed for the environment, and you can often cause more harm than good. And so that's why the characteristics are so important. I can train almost anybody to do a skill, right? Almost anybody can be taught to shoot a weapon, operate a radio, or any other of the skills that we teach people to do. But judgment and problem solving and team building and this emotional intelligence quotient, if you will, that allows you to understand another culture, bond with them, and then turn it into influence to achieve objectives and outcomes. That's a special mix of characteristics.
The next generation of soldiers coming through the ranks. We talked a lot about 9/11. We talked about the global war on terror, but many of the young soldiers who are coming in now, and even the officers who tend to be a little bit older because they've experienced college and stuff. 9/11 was before some of their births, and at the very least, they were very young. They didn't experience it like we did. How is that changing the perception, and how is that changing how we have to approach recruiting, how we bring people into the organization? Because they don't have that same sense that we did of, I have to get out there make an impact on the world. People did violence against our nation and our way of life, and I have to go fight for my nation, stand up for what's right, protect freedom at all costs. For them, it's a distant memory. It's something they've seen on TV.
Yeah, I think it starts with understanding that, anyway, my assumption that in every generation, there is a group of young people that do want to do something different, that do want to achieve something special. And they may not have formed that into a thesis, if you will,
right,
and know exactly what it is. And to some extent, you've got to find that person who's not satisfied with the 9 to 5. It's your video, right? There is a whole set of folks out there that in their upbringing or whatever their experience set is in their youth and teenage years and early 20s, that says, I want to do more. I want to challenge myself. I want to see how tough I am, how good I am, et cetera. And I think we need to find those people and bring them in. And part of it, though, is also then making sure they understand that, we were motivated by 9/11. I was originally motivated by, the challenges of the Cold War, right? We all came for a different reason at the time. But it's important to understand that the nation always has adversaries. I mean, you look at the world today, it's actually, much messier in a lot of ways than it was in the Cold War. And even after 9/11, I mean, after 9/11, it was very clear we were fighting this Islamic-driven ideology, that was, global war on terror, if you will. But it was really a fight against, this, virulent, nefarious strain of his Islamic ideology turned against the West. Well, there are adversaries today that want to undermine our way of life. Mm-hmm. And I think we're starting to acknowledge that more publicly. But, there's no doubt in my mind that the ideology of the Communist Party of China is not consistent with the U.S. and Western worldview of how the global architecture is structured. And if you believe that what we have in the U.S. is worth defending, then you ought to find your way to a recruiting station and raise your hand and join and be a part of it. Or go take the Foreign Service Officer test and become a member of the State Department, or find the local recruiting billboard for the CIA or any other capabilities that allow us to compete. Because whether we realize it or not, we are really in an existential struggle with two powers, for sure, that want to order the world in a way that is disadvantages us and is much more in their outlook, and that's Russia and China. And China is the one that worries me the most.
Well, let's talk about that, because for so many years we've called it the next battlefield, but that battlefield is today. I mean, we, as you said, we are in this battle with Russia and China. I mean, just to name some of the things. I mean, yesterday, Russia announced the annexation of 4 Ukrainian territories.
Yeah.
They are now Russia. We haven't seen actions like this since Hitler.
Right. Exactly.
China's threatening Asian partners. They're dominating natural resource extraction out of Africa and dropping hundreds of thousands of Chinese citizens in Africa just to gain presence. Iran continues to fund international terrorism. North Korea restarted nuclear operations. These countries are not poor. They're not desolate. They're not what we faced in Afghanistan by and large. It's a different threat. It's not Iraq. It's not a lot of those Middle Eastern countries that we've operated in for the last 20 years. They're what we've called these near peer. They have technology. They have smart people.
Yeah, personally,
they have money, resources.
I'm not a believer in the near peer terminology because it undersells the threat. China is not a near peer. They're a peer.
They're a peer. Yeah.
And in some areas of capability, and I would say the same for the Russians, in some areas of capability, we may be the near peer.
Yeah, that's a good point.
They have advanced past where we are from a capability perspective.
We had General Weldon on, Craig Weldon. We talked about hypersonic technology because he's working with a company called Volantra. China has surpassed the U.S. in hypersonic technology because our last innovation was the SR Blackbird aircraft from the 60s.
Yeah, I'd hope we've got more than that, but that's you're right. That's an area where we are struggling to catch up right now. But I'd say there's other areas as well. I mean, you look at their capabilities in the information domain and willingness to shape what we talked before, this ability to influence foreign audiences. And some of it's not really a capability or a capacity issue. Some of it's, frankly, a willingness to do it, orchestrate it, have a vision and a narrative and a strategy to work against. This is where our democratic institutions somewhat work against us, right? I mean, we make national policy by consensus of executive branch and Congress, et cetera. Yeah. And that doesn't make for an agile development of an information strategy, certainly in the employment of it. So, but there are other areas as well where our adversaries have outpaced us. I mean, face it, we spent a lot of time focused in the Middle East and sort of ignored the developing threats, and they made up a lot of ground. I think part of it was, frankly, we also had a failed strategy, right? You look at China's rise, and much of China's rise, arguably a lot of China's rise, was empowered by the U.S. And it started with, the Kissinger-Nixon opening to China, right? With the idea of, hey, if we leverage China against Russia, it'll help us in the Cold War. And we had a thesis as a strategy, as a nation, that if we helped them rise and built their economy and brought them into a first world economy, that it would, as a byproduct, they would also move away from communism and towards a more democratic society. I think even the believers in that strategy now have declared it a failure and said, they were able to rise without ditching communism. In fact, communism is as strong as ever. At least the Communist Party is as strong as ever. So, to some extent, we have ourselves to blame for the creation of China as an adversary, or at least the powerful capability that China can wield, because it's driven by vast economic power that we helped create.
We're also in this interesting situation, and I'll specifically kind of speak. We can talk. It pertains to China as well, but we're seeing it in the news every day with respect to with the situation in Ukraine and Russia, where we're saying in one respect, well, we're not directly confronting them, and then in another respect, we're pumping trillions of dollars into Ukraine, sending them weapons, and so you have to ask yourself, we are directly confronting them. And now, Putin's talking about, threatening the use of nuclear weapons if we continue these actions. What is the danger, number one, in coming out and saying we're directly confronting you? And in the adverse, what is the danger in not coming out and saying we're directly confronting you?
Yeah, it's interesting. I spent a lot of time at USASOC, 15 to 18, as we were making this pivot as a nation to kind of great power competition, as we call it. And we and SOCOM writ large were pushing this concept of, hey, yes, you have to focus on getting ready for peer-to-peer conventional conflict, but you also have to recognize that great power competition historically isn't really marked so much by conventional conflict as by this level of competitive nature in what we call the gray zone, this short of a head-on-head Russians fighting the U.S. formations in Europe, and it's much more about subversion, sabotage, working through proxies, because that's really how the Cold War played out. Generally, great powers don't want to fight each other because nobody wins. Right. You look at, the last wars of empire, right? World War I and World War II, Britain trying to defend their empire, Germany trying to get a piece of the pie, and who won? Nobody. Right? Britain wins both wars and loses the empire that they were fighting for, and they, feeling the effects of rationing, et cetera, into the 50s. I mean, they essentially bankrupted the country to fight this great power war. And I think any sane or rational person looks at a conflict with China or Russia with those same kind of fears. But the reality is that doesn't prevent nations from still wanting to achieve their objectives. And that's what we've seen with Russia and China both. They are willing to take risks and operate in this environment and threshold below conventional conflict and do things that create advantage. So China turning piles of rock into islands that can be militarized in the South China Sea.
Yeah.
Is it an act of war? No, it's not me shooting at you, but it is creating a military advantage so that they can control the South China Sea and the sea lanes and eventually extend their influence and domain further into the South China Sea. And the question is, given when you look at what Russia does, when you look at what China does, as a nation, the choice is, do we counteract this? Do we confront it? Or do we sit back and do nothing? And I think most sane national security experts say, hey, we see the trend here. They are changing the environment to their advantage and our disadvantage and that of our allies. And the question is, what do we do? And then how do you do it in a nuanced way that still that achieves your objectives, yet doesn't lead you to what we all say we want to avoid, which is a catastrophic conflict head on head. And that's, essentially you're seeing that play out right now in the Ukraine, right? We haven't put our own troops on the ground. We have, through our arguably surrogate, the Ukrainian military. I mean, obviously they're fighting for their own nation's survival, right. But our willingness to empower them and help them with intel and equipment and advice, et cetera, is exacting a toll on the Russians, which is hopefully going to stymie their expansionist campaign.
What's the biggest threat today?
The biggest threat today? Lack of national unity and understanding that there are things that threaten our nationhood, our sovereignty, and we are so focused on contemplating our navel that we've lost an understanding of the greater danger in the world. Mm-hmm. We're fighting partisan politics at a time when we should be figuring out how to better develop the capabilities to compete with China, how to unify all the elements of national power. The Chinese are robbing our industry blind for both economic and military gain. And we're arguing over, I won't get into.
You name it.
I won't get into partisan politics.
You name
but
it.
You fill in the blank
I
there. I mean, when you look at the things that matter to a nation, and what our strategic leaders in Congress and the executive branch are focused on, you got to scratch your head and say, how does this contribute to the safety of America and the Western world?
Yeah, I've said that a few times. I mean, you look at some of these congressional hearings that are going on, and it's like, why are we wasting time on this? You brought up the elements of national power. I had it here in my notes, and that's DIME, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic lines. I mean, these are the things that countries and great powers use in varying forms. How they approach each one of these is what defines their national power, and how do they leverage them to achieve their strategic aims. We talked about being challenged, and you brought it up here because we are being challenged both foreign and domestic, and you mentioned the term the world order, and this world order is being challenged. We've talked about this in a number of episodes. Why does America have to continue to lead from the front on the global stage?
I think the question needs to be asked in America: does the world order as it exists today benefit Americans and our allies, and do we want to maintain it? There are some that argue that actually America, North America, with its Canadian and Mexican partners, would survive just fine as a regional power and could protect America.
Isolationism.
I won't call it isolationism, but it's a stepping back, a retrenchment, if you will. If you read Peter Zihan, I don't know how he pronounces it. His latest book is basically saying, hey, America could survive economically. The world order is crumbling for a lot of reasons, partly because America doesn't want to enforce it anymore. And that essentially, we've lived since the end of World War II, Bretton Woods, America and in the U.S. Navy made the world safe for all trade. We opened our markets and we said, as long as you side with us in this world order, you can trade with America. We'll buy your products. We'll protect the sea lanes and make the global economy run. And we'll use the U.S. dollar as and his argument is that's an unnatural state and doesn't need to continue if we chose not to. We've got essentially energy independence. One of the reasons we've maintained the world order is we needed foreign energy. We don't anymore if we choose to use what we have naturally. So the question, I guess, first is, do we want to maintain the order? And if the answer to that is yes, and I personally think it is still yes, because the picture he paints, and it's a book worth reading if you haven't read it.
Yeah, I am going to read this.
Is and something like the end of the world is just the beginning. I'll share it with you after this, but it's a really interesting economic demographic view of the world, as well as a little bit of policy. But the question, assuming that and I think the answer is yes, we want to maintain the world order, not just for the benefit of the U.S., but for the benefit of the world. That then you have to say, okay, there are places where we have to draw a line. There is competition we have to enter. The Russian and Chinese vision is much different for a world. The Chinese vision is a world order dominated by China and by the Chinese Communist Party. And I think we've seen enough of how that works that we probably don't want that for us or our allies. And so therefore you've got to say, okay, so how and where do we stop their growth and development of capability and influence outside of their borders and their region? I mean, Ukraine. I think Ukraine and Russia has brought this to a very sharp point right now. And you still hear there are voices in America right now that say, why are we spending billions to arm the Ukrainians when there's so much that we could do with those billions here at home? And certainly we are a democracy. We should have that dialogue. And the national leadership should be able to make the case of, we are doing this because it's in these national interests, that this is the natural evolution of things if we allow Russia to succeed here. That has got to be part of that conversation we had before, right? Of strategic leadership owns the responsibility to mobilize the nation against purpose. And I'm not sure we've done that yet.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to ask you, because we spent a lot of time here in this conversation talking about that the strategic vision that has to exist to unify the nation. And when you look today, you have to ask yourself the question of, have we committed to a strategy? Certainly on different sides of the aisle, we probably have not, but we have to start to really think about, who do we want to be, and how are we going to choose and then mobilize our populace, mobilize these elements of national power to achieve that aim? Because I asked you the question about, will we learn? I would argue that this battle that we are in, it's not the battle of tomorrow. It's here and it's present. It's been here, probably taking us a little too long to realize we were here. But this is one that we can't lose, in my mind.
And we talk about mobilizing, all the elements of national power. At its essence, all our power as a democracy springs from the people. And so we can, we often jump to coordinating and making sure our economic sanctions and our diplomatic outreach and our military actions are synchronized against the objective. But in the end, we often forget the fact that it has to be explained to the American people, and they have to commit as well. Mm-hmm. Once again, we go back to World War II. We were an isolationist country leading up to World War II, and even in the opening years of World War II.
Yeah.
And it took presidential leadership, and arguably the event of Pearl Harbor. But we could have, without national leadership mobilizing us to the World War, we were attacked by Japan. And yet we embarked on an America or a Europe first strategy. Mm-hmm. We mobilized the people for both a war against Japan, but also the Germans and the Italian Axis partner. That's national leadership.
Yeah. I think I look at this too in terms of what's the war we want to fight next, and so many times it feels like we don't want to fight the same war. I don't want my son who's 2, and your son who's serving. Just to be
correct for your listeners, the war we want to fight next is no war.
Yeah,
right?
Well, that's
true. We don't
true.
want to fight. What we're looking to do is, how do we deter?
Right.
Right. I don't want my sons to have to fight, or their sons.
Yeah.
And when you talk about why should we be engaged now, the purpose of engagement now is to preserve the interests of the U.S. and our allies in a way that deters our adversaries from ever creating this choice between fight or lose. Mm-hmm. And that's what you're seeing in Ukraine right now, I believe, is that if we don't support the Ukrainians and help them stop Russian action now, where's the next place?
Yeah. Then our kids fight the Russians again.
We watched them invade Georgia, and we arguably did nothing. We've watched them exert influence with cyber attacks in places like Estonia, essentially bringing the country, to its cyber knees, so to speak, and we did nothing. We watched the invasion of Crimean Peninsula and then eastern Ukraine. We put in some sanctions, but essentially we moved on. We kind of lost the bubble to a lot of ways, and yet their actions continue to build. And the question is, if not here, where?
Right. Let's talk about the Green Beret Foundation.
Okay.
You've been the chairman since July 2019, and we previously had Brent Cooper on, who's the executive director, and really I've enjoyed building the relationship with the Green Beret Foundation since I got out, and also since we started the Jedburgh podcast. And so, affiliation with this organization is so important to me, and getting to know everybody there has been really one of the highlights for me over the last year and a half of building the Jedburgh podcast. So first, I just want to thank you and thank the Green Beret Foundation for all the support that they've given us, and we'll continue to support the organization in every way that we possibly can. The organization has made some tremendous strides over the last couple of years, and most notably committing to supporting Green Berets of all generations. Right. And initially when the organization was created, it was very focused on the post 9/11. That was front and center, but that's expanded out and to the entire Green Beret community. And there's a number of other pillars I want to talk about, but in your words, what is the mission of the Green Beret Foundation? What's the vision that you have for it over the course of the next couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, we've spent all this time talking about all the great work that Green Berets do for the nation, but it comes at a cost. And sometimes that's physical wounds of war. Sometimes it's mental effects of war. But it's also the stress and demands of a hard training regimen. It's the impacts of a lot of time away on families, et cetera. And so, in essence, we're there to help meet the needs that the official government organizations don't meet. And we're blessed. I mean, we really do have a great government support structure, between government insurance, between the VA, all of those things. But there are still things that fall into gaps, particularly given that the bureaucracy moves a little slower to accept cutting edge treatments and procedures. So we fund some of that for folks that are dealing with PTSD and TBI. But we're also broadly supporting the overall organization with things like helping families, continuing education, hard for wives that move around a lot to take education through to a degree. So we give out scholarships, but we also are helping with family programs to just alleviate the stress and strain of life. And then probably the most significant thing we've added on in the last year and a half is we've been accredited by the Veterans Administration to be an accredited veteran service organization to help transitioning service members and service members who are already out with their VA claims process. And this is really where we're able to support, Vietnam veterans and others. We've recently had an 83-year-old Vietnam vet whose wounds had deteriorated his physical capability to the point where he now needed a wheelchair, accommodation in the home, in the car, et cetera. And our VSOs were actually able to look at his 1974 or 5 medical record and trace back the problems he's dealing with now to wounds he suffered in Vietnam and re-adjudicate his VA claim all these years later and win him a much more significant benefit to help accommodate life today to what it would have been. So in short, part of this mission of the Green Beret Foundation is to take care of the Green Berets and their families, past and present, with these emergency needs. But it's also this philosophy, at least my personal take on our mission, is that Green Berets, having been specially selected, trained, been all this experience they've amassed, are really a national asset. I mean, these are the top 1% of the top 1% who serve in our military, and the nation needs to maximize their capabilities in service to society. So a big part of what we're doing is trying to make sure we take care of them while they're in service so they can do the work of the military, but then help them transition well into civilian life afterwards, so that they can continue to make a difference for society, because they're people who are inclined towards serving the nation. They've got great capabilities, skills, and a solid character. And now we need to figure out how to help them find their purpose in continuing to serve the nation once they leave the military.
Yeah, and transition's hard.
Yeah.
I mean, transition is
it's
really
hard for everybody. I mean, you've lived it. I've lived it. I spent 4 years at West Point and 35 years in the service, and then all of a sudden, did okay. You reached, kind of near the top there, 3-star general, and you think, how hard can it be to transition into the civilian world? It's damn hard. Yeah. Right. I mean, and the longer you stay, the harder it is, I think. Right.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's we joke all the time that you have to figure out what you're going to be when you grow up.
Yeah.
And I think it doesn't matter if you served 4 years. I mean, I did 13 years. You did 35 years. And you still are like, man, I still get to go to work. And I jump out of planes, and my ride to work is a Black Hawk helicopter, and I shoot gun. I get paid to shoot guns and climb mountains and make an impact in the world. And then one day you turn in your ID card and you drive off the base and you look in the rearview mirror and you realize that everybody you know, all your friends, your way of life is sitting behind that gate.
Right. Well, it's you're disconnected from that close-knit group of teammates and like-minded individuals, and you're disconnected from purpose. Right. I had a purpose. It was get ready for the next mission. It was fight the nation's wars. Whatever it was. We had a common purpose and a group of high quality folks focused on that purpose. And to some extent, part of the transition, and we work with other nonprofits that actually kind of zero in on this aspect. Is step one of transition is first leave well, and that's part of that VA process, right? Don't leave any benefits left on the table. you gotta exit properly.
I'm 6 years out, and I'm still working with
Yeah.
to fight my claim.
And we
working
see
with
that a lot. We see
CBF
that a lot
now.
with guys who, when they leave, they say, "Hey, they're so focused on getting a job that they don't transition well on the bureaucratic side and document the fact that, I've got serious back problems. My neck is fried from wearing night vision goggles for 20 years. All these different things that'll come back to haunt them if they don't get it documented in the process. And that's kind of what we do with the VA process. But then it's, how do you find purpose of what you want to do when you grow up, as we call it? And so we do partner with some of the other organizations out there that are very focused on helping people that aren't sure where they fit in the civilian world, how they can fit, and what they might want to try. But it's difficult. I mean, my last civilian job before entering West Point was scoring softball games for the local town and rec. And other than that, not a lot of civilian work experience, right? And so you're trying to figure out, where do I fit? And most of us end up talking to others who have gone before us, and you do hey, what did you do? How did you transition this? And a lot of it's kind of word of mouth. Have you thought about this? Make sure you do this. And so there's a lot of informal mentorship going on. But part of what Green Beret Foundation is doing is, in our transition line of effort, is really trying to formalize that a little bit. Still rely on the network and all those people who have successfully transitioned, but bring a little bit of structure and organization to it.
Well, I think it's important to note too that, and it didn't exist when I was getting out, but there's now a Green Beret Foundation representative in each of the active groups.
Right, and that we've put this trained veteran service officer, or VSO, at each of the active groups. 2 here in Fort Bragg because of the size of the enterprise here, and they are that entry for all Green Beret. They're primarily there to help on the VSO transition, or the Veterans Administration transition, but they're also there as a advocate for all the other Green Beret Foundation services that we provide for the active. And they're also sort of a regional rep, because we're trying to figure out how to provide our National Guard counterparts an entry point, but also the retiree and formers. So they know that, hey, if I have a VA problem or some other Green Beret Foundation program that I could access, if I live in Connecticut, my regional rep is here at Fort Bragg, so to speak, right? So you have a name and a phone number to go to.
We were talking earlier, and I made the comment that you had the opportunity to lead the most elite forces and individuals, I believe, in the world, and that the world has ever seen.
I agree with you, but neither of them are probably very objective in that, that judgment. But.
Yeah, that's not a subjective assessment. That's fact. Yeah. But they're also the most stubborn. They're also, in many ways, the most type A.
Yeah.
They're the first, or they're the last people in a lot of respects to admit that they're hurting, admit that they have a problem, physically, mentally, in so many ways. The last 20 years, as we talked about, has put a tremendous strain on so many of our special operators. And none of us, I don't think any of us get out unscathed in some way. There has been a stigma for so long around mental health and around the ability of somebody to ask for help. Special operators, I think about the guys on my team, the guys at group, at the battalion level who I worked with, who you can visibly see have scars and need to talk about things, and they just won't, because we are programmed in so many ways to, as you said, solve complex problems around the world. And we look in ourselves and we say, well, I've solved the most strategic problems the world has ever seen. Why can't I solve this problem for myself? I have to figure it out internally. And so instead of reaching out, we go internal. Yeah. Where are we with respect to mental health? What do we have to do? How do we reduce the stigma? And the reason why I'm bringing it up here is because I want everyone who's listening to know that I don't care if you're a special operator or a Green Beret, we're here, and make the call.
Yeah.
Call me, call you, call any of us.
Yeah. I will start with, at the Green Beret Foundation, we have opened a program focused on this. It's Andy's fund, and people can donate specifically to that fund. It's a restricted program so that you know that your dollars go then to this Andy's fund. That's a mental health focused program. So we're using the money to fund care for folks that are in need. Named for Andy Marcinko, who was a Green Beret who killed himself. One of these typical Green Berets, right? Strong, powerful, problem solver, leader, and shocked a lot of folks in the community when he committed suicide. And there's a lot like him. And you're right. I mean, we do have this self-reliant gene, if you will. When guys get physically hurt, they're always trying to power through. How do I quickly get back to my team, company, whatever? In the shortest amount of time. But at least with physical ailments, you can see it, you can understand it, and everybody accepts that. Clearly he took a bullet through the chest. It's going to take him a week or two to get back to work. Whereas the mental health aspect, it's invisible. It's hard to quantify. It's often hard for the individual to say exactly what's going on. And you really see this with the side effects of traumatic brain injury, right? I mean, they're just not right. And sometimes they realize they're just not right. And sometimes it's their family that realizes they're not right, or their teammates. And I think we've done a lot to try and address the fact that, hey, it's okay to ask for help. We really do want you to help. And if you're, and really part of this is getting the word out to the families as well. Hey, look, we're going to take care of your loved one and make sure their professional career continues as best it can. But when you're probably the first person to see that he or she is not what they were before this IED blast or before this traumatic experience, and raise the flag and say, I think my husband or wife needs help. Here are the symptoms. Here's what I'm seeing. Because a lot of times, either through failure to admit something's going on, or even the ability to understand that something has changed in their behavior or their mental aspect, or just this self-reliant, I can power through sort of approach. Guys don't ask for help in time. I mean, the suicide thing is, frankly, I've seen it throughout my career. We had a lieutenant in the 82nd, my company over from us, commit suicide. First time I saw it, but it's almost like a thread of continuity through my career. It's touched in my personal life as well. We've got to do better as humans, understanding the people around us, and seeing when they're in need, and helping them recognize that they are in need and getting them to the right resources. And we're not alone in the military with this. I think the nation has a mental health crisis.
Absolutely.
Maybe perhaps the world. I mean, certainly we have it here in the U.S. and we've got to do better to figure out how to reach out to our fellow man and get them help.
What's next for Ken Tovo, now that it's Lieutenant General R?
Yeah, so I'm doing a little bit of work. We talked about my nonprofit work with the Green Beret Foundation, which takes up a fair amount of time. But I sit on a couple boards. I do some advisory work. I still do some work back here in the Special Warfare Center. Senior mentor at one of the courses they run here on strategy and operational design, and I also help out with the pre-command course, mentoring future commanders and sergeant majors and chief warrant officers before they go into lieutenant colonel and colonel level command. So, and other than that, I think I'm working really hard to bring my golf handicap down.
Wait, well, you're in a great area for golf.
And I'm also honing my fly fishing skills.
Every day is Saturday.
That and kind of continue to be in my son's lives, my wife, of 37 years, and make up for time lost, if you will.
Yeah. And
I've got two grandsons that have just moved back into the area, and trying to, like all things, everything is a competition. I'm trying to win at the granddad game.
I love it. Ken, as we close out, the Jedburghs had to do 3 things every day to be successful. We could call them habits. if you will. I call them foundational tasks, foundational skills. They had to be able to shoot, they had to be able to move, and they had to be able to communicate. I think 3 things that you're intimately familiar with through your career. But if they did these 3 things with the utmost precision, then they didn't have to focus on them in their day-to-day. They could actually focus on more complex challenges that came their way. What are the 3 things that you do every day in your world to set the conditions for success?
Well, I think you've got to have purpose. You've got to know what you want to achieve. I'm a believer in goals and objectives, both short, medium, and long term. You got to know what you're moving towards, and so you got to revisit the why, if you will, of how you're living your life at that phase. What are you trying to accomplish? I think you got to be focused. It's so easy in today's world to go down an internet rabbit hole.
Hours on Instagram.
And it's really hard if you're, a lot of the work I do now is computer centric, right? VTC, teleconferences, and, reading emails and writing the notes back. And, God, it's just really easy to open another screen and get away from work and, I don't know, check out my Yankee scores or something, right? There is just a lot of distractions in our world, and you got to have a purpose, and then you got to be focused on the purpose and revisit, what am I trying to accomplish? What are my goals? Am I moving towards my goals? And it's just self-assessment thing, which is to me a part of the focus is, where am I today? Am I reaching objectives? Am I making progress? Am I moving forward? And then I think the last thing is it goes to our know your operational environment comment from before, but to me it's somewhat rolled up into education. You got to be a lifetime learner. So you talk about things I do every day. I start and continue through the day. My wife would accuse me it's one of my rabbit holes. But I spend a lot of time just trying to understand what's going on in the world around me. Mm-hmm. So, morning springs, I try and get some PT in on most days. But the other thing I do is I'm reading through my news feeds, and it's the range. I don't fall into an ideological vein in the information I take in. So, I'm looking at a ideologically spread view of news. I try and stay more toward the middle because, frankly, the fringes are a waste of time. Yeah. But I'm trying to figure out what's going on in the world, particularly in those things in the national security environment, because that's most of where my work consulting is, and just try and stay in touch with things. But I also read more broadly. I love technology. I think we're in an era in world history where we're about to, turn asymmetric on the development curve. And everything from artificial intelligence, data analytics, quantum, bioengineering. I mean, it's just an exciting time in the world. And all of those new technological fields can feed change in other areas. Mm-hmm. And so you gotta be watching broadly of where the world is going in a lot of different ways, demographics, economics, technology, to understand and anticipate, even in a narrow lane like the defense field, what the future might bring. So I think education is foundational to everything we do. So, that enough for you?
I love it. Yeah, know your why, know your purpose. Where do you want to go? Second, be focused. Self-assess. Make sure you're still on that path and achieving those goals. And 3, be a lifetime learner.
Got to learn. Got to grow. In anything you do, it doesn't matter what the field is.
I agree with all of them. We talked a lot about character. We talked a lot about what it takes to build special operations units, serve in special operations, the impact that these organizations have had across the world, the impact that they've had on us and our lives and who we are and how we define ourselves. At the end of these conversations, I take these 9 characteristics that sum up so many things that we've talked about here, and I think about the conversation I have with my guests, and I give them one. And I think about the one that defines them. And every once in a while, I sit across from somebody where I can't pick. and I don't have one. And I say that, and really because the reality is they define them all, and they define them all across everything that they've done. And that's my situation as I sit here with you today in the Special Warfare Museum, is that there is not one of these 9 that you exhibit in any more way than the other, because in order to lead the organizations that you've led, to define the world order in so much of the way that you have over the last 35 years of your career, and the impact that you had on young officers like me and so many others like me, is truly inspirational. You have been and will be for a very long time and forever a legend in this organization. So much of what we sit in here today, we'll walk through the halls here now, and your affiliation and name is on so much of this place. And I just want to thank you. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for instilling in me these characteristics and allowing and affording me the opportunity to serve in this regiment, which has defined my life and my purpose. And just thank you.
Well, you're welcome. I took a lot more from my 35 years of service than I gave. I mean, I think you know what I'm saying. It is truly the core of my experience. It formed who I am and who I was and will be for the rest of my life. And, we go back to why would young men and women want to serve today? I think it's that effect, right? I mean, it makes you so much more than I ever could have been if I had, gone to be some 9-to-5 job. It's everything that video says. So been a pleasure talking to you, and thanks for doing the podcast.
Absolutely. American Jedburghs went out to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh Podcast. I'm your creator and host, Fran Racioppi. Join us next week for a new episode on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Check us out on YouTube for full episodes, highlights, and other behind-the-scenes content. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow me, Fran Racioppi, Talent War Group, and our sponsor Jersey Mike Subs on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Send your comments and inquiries to media@talentwargroup.com. As a former member of Special Forces, the Jedburgh Podcast donates a percentage of all proceeds to the Green Beret Foundation, supporting America's Special Forces and their families. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.